Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Today, we are joined by award-winning historian and author Tim Bouverie. Tim has most recently received wide praise for his book, Allies at War, which some people may know from the book's strategic placement next to Prime Minister Netanyahu in a photo of the Prime Minister calling President Trump on the night of the first military strikes on Iran. The book does exactly what it says on the proverbial tin. It provides a narrative history of relations between the Allies who opposed Hitler. While one can rightly ask what new could possibly be written on this topic, Tim Bouverie answers that question on nearly every page of the book. And the critics have certainly agreed, with the book winning the prestigious 2026 Paul Roget Duff Cooper Prize and The Economist naming it one of its 2025 books of the year, calling it, quote, a masterful diplomatic history of the Second World War, packed with fresh detail and gossipy anecdotes, end quote. While we spend plenty of time discussing fascinating tales of Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, Tim also draws lessons from this most successful of political and military alliances that are highly applicable to today's tumultuous world order. If you enjoyed this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. We are pleased to welcome Tim Bouverie to Earlylands in Conversation. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. Where are we catching you at?
I'm in the UK. I'm down in Wiltshire.
Well, I'm talking to you from London, actually, and this has not been a good week for London weather.
It's temperamental, like our politics.
Gosh, we could get started on West Streeting and co right now, but let's talk about other sorts of allies and rivals. Let's talk about the book. I was telling you before we got started here that I always pop into a bookshop or two just walking around London, and Allies at War has been in the window or on the front table of pretty much every shop I've been in. And now having read it, and actually I listened to it on Audible, which was a real pleasure. You know, I can't congratulate you enough on the book. But I mean, let me start by asking this question. I mean, there is of course, a massive, unbelievable number of books that have been written about the Second World War. When you finished Appeasement, your sort of first book, what convinced you that there was a genuinely new book to be written here that, wasn't more than just a synthesis of 100 other wonderful works? And what was the gap that you saw? And then walk us through that process of how you started the research.
Well, as you say, I'd written this book, Appeasement, Chamberlain, Hitler, Churchill, and the Road to War, which was all about the policy of trying to avoid a major European and global conflict by making concessions to
Right.
Adolf Hitler,
Right.
one which went spectacularly wrong. So this was a book about politics and high-level diplomacy. And like you, Todd, I had read a vast amount about the Second World War by some very distinguished historians. But it had often seemed to me that there was too much of an abrupt change between the literature that preceded the war and then the literature on the war itself. By which I mean that too often then, the story of 1939 to 1945 just becomes one of tanks and aircraft, of battles and espionage and theaters of war and naval conflict.
Grand movements of men, right?
Exactly. But politics carried on, and politics was absolutely critical to the Second World War. At its most fundamental, the only reason that the Allied side won the Second World War was because of politics. And there was an awful lot of politics going on behind the scenes, behind the battles, between the main Allied powers, but also including the lesser Allied powers and the various neutral powers, from Francoist Spain to Ireland and Turkey. And it was this that I really felt needed attention. And I thought that by writing a diplomatic and political history of this alliance, something new could be said. And I hoped, I didn't know for certain, but I thought that if I really did go through just about every archive that is available — I've spent 3 years researching this and went through 100 different collections of private papers — actually new material could be found that sheds light on an otherwise familiar story.
Absolutely. And I love the way you laid out the book. It goes, like you said, the UK's relationship with neutral Spain or barely neutral Spain, engagement with India. And I was embarrassed a number of times throughout the book. I should have known that fact, which highlighted to me that, yes, there may be groaning shelves at Waterstone, but there are still so much to untapped in the story of this conflict. And like you say, you drew on more than 100 archives, and you can certainly tell. I mean, to get every single page of the book, I found that there was an anecdote or something or just a simple fact that I didn't know. And again, I have probably, as my wife would attest to, read far too many books about the Second World War. But, when you were a historian starting with that scope, how did you approach the problem of not drowning in the material? Walking into yet another archive and realizing that there were 200 boxes that hadn't been opened. How did you manage to keep the research scope manageable for you?
Well, I'm not sure I did at the research level. It took the research alone took 3 years. For that reason, and the fact that I'm quite a slow writer, that I'm embarrassed to admit that I spent longer working on this book than the events it describes. Admittedly, my Second World War was rather less deadly than the one that occurred between 39 and 45, but it certainly felt like a struggle at times. The research is vast, and it could be endless. There comes a point where you have to withdraw to your tent and actually start to write.
Right.
The most important thing to me, though, is not to allow your narrative to be subsumed by too much material, trying to cram everything in. And I hope, it's up to my readers to judge this, I hope I succeeded in making it pacey and not making it too dense, despite the fact that it's got all this research that went into it. Because what I feel is really critical is what distinguishes for me a strong history book from a weak history book is that you feel that the author is making very strong judgments based on a very substantial foundation of research, that they're not going to go through every single box to justify this
Right.
strong statement that they've made, but you know that they could if they had to, and indeed there are references that corroborate that element of research, and yet feeling that you are prepared to throw out a huge amount of material that you have found just because you suddenly
Sure.
think, well, yes, this might be new and it might add a bit of color here, it might add further detail here, but your primary service is to your readers, and your readers want to get on with the story. And however much we've all enjoyed a book, I have never met anyone who has ever said at the end of a novel or a work of nonfiction, despite however much they might have enjoyed it, saying, God, I just wish that had been an extra 100 pages.
Was there a sort of an arc of history, an arc of the history of the war that really surprised you once you dug into this? Or did you find that how you started is sort of how you ended in terms of your perceptions?
Certainly, my perceptions changed as I went through the research. They didn't really change once I started the writing. I do all the research first, and then I do the writing. I think you
Right.
have to have a idea of where you're going from the very beginning rather than doing it
Right.
at the same time. I think I knew what the broad themes of the work were going to be, and I certainly had read a lot of secondary literature on the Second World War beforehand. But there are certain things which surprised me. I think the level of distrust that there was in America in general and in Washington in particular for the
Right.
British and
Right.
their empire was something that really
Yeah.
struck
The
me.
number of
And
times that my countrymen use the word limey or other sort of slanderous terms to refer to Churchill and his entourage, you cover that very well.
well, yeah, and the British were equally very rude, often about the Americans.
Right.
The difference is that the British were not in a position to exploit their prejudices, whereas the Americans, with the fact that they weren't in the war until December of 1941,
Right.
and that they were then the predominant military and certainly economic power, they were able to pursue what was their secondary war aim, which was the dismantling of the British Empire. And the British
Right.
Empire was going in any case, and it would have
Right.
gone in any case. So we should not blame America entirely for this. And when I say that this was an American war aim, I'm not placing any value judgment on this. And I'm not going to make a moral judgment on whether it was a good idea or a bad idea for America to try and connive at the dismantling of the British Empire. I'm simply stating it as a matter of fact that this was the Roosevelt administration's long held war aim, something that preceded the outbreak of war by at least a decade.
Oh, I understand that. I think as an armchair historian that, of course, that Roosevelt was not a fan of the British Empire, the French Empire, et cetera. But some of the quotes that you have from American officials make that very clear that this empire is running on fumes and we're not going to refill the tank, things like that. And I thought that you did particularly around India, I thought you make that case very, very well. I mean, was there anything that upended your assumptions? Though? Did you find, for example, when researching keeping Spain out of the war, keeping Spain neutral, that perhaps that was more of a coup than is typically understood? West Africa, for example, about the attempts to unseat the Vichy in Senegal. Was there something that you felt hasn't received the attention that it properly is due based on its impact on the war and its course?
I'd be cautious about saying that I have come across something which is going to upend our understanding, because you will find scholarly articles on the importance of Spain and how Britain managed to keep it neutral elsewhere. I did actually come across a lot of new material, particularly the letters of David Eccles, the economic representative in the Iberian Peninsula of the British government, to a Foreign Office colleague, which I think adds a lot to this. I'm cautious about saying that I came across a totally new thesis. I certainly was able to add to it with new material. But you're right in that beyond the academy, a lot of the areas I write about haven't made it into the popular
Right.
literature. And there were an awful lot of sideshows to the Second World War, and we only know them as sideshows because they were kept as sideshows. Spain could have become the main
Indeed.
event had the British not managed to help convince Franco to remain neutral. He obviously came to this conclusion largely on his own, but it could have been made for him in the negative sense by unwise action on Britain's part. Similarly, the way that the British collaborated with the Free French and General de Gaulle while the American government continued to lend legitimacy to the collaborationist, pro-Nazi, Holocaust participating government at Vichy under Marshal Pétain is deeply shocking and is a subject which I don't think has been nearly so significantly explored.
I knew that we had reserved our recognition of the Free French for quite some time, but I just didn't realize, for example, Cordell Hull, the American Secretary of State, and I'm forgetting the names of the islands off the coast of Canada that the Free French had seized, but the absolute diplomatic calamity that he made of that, those escaped my attention. Not that it says anything, but I thought you did a wonderful job of bringing those back to the fore.
Well, certainly. I mean, I think this is a very, very odd episode. The islands are called Saint Pierre and Miquelon, and
Right,
they're
right.
two tiny French islands off the coast of Canada, and they are in the hands of a couple of Vichy officials. There's no major military installments
I think you
on
said
these
what,
islands.
11 police officers or something like that?
Yeah, there's 11 police officers, and just at the time that America comes into war, the Free French Navy seizes the islands for the Free French, and instead of applauding this great coup or minor coup
Right.
by an allied power fighting the common enemy, Cordell Hull issues a statement condemning it and then spends a lot of diplomatic capital trying to persuade the Free French to give the islands back to the Vichy French. And this is absolutely astonishing. I mean, the phrase he uses, and I think this is quite funny, the response to this is he talks about them in his statement as the so-called Free French. And that in turn engenders bags and bags of letters and telegrams to the State Department addressed to Cordell Hull, the so-called Secretary of State.
To the credit, fortunately, of the American people, they found that the Free French taking those islands was well within their rights. Such an interesting side note of history. I do want to ask, and we try to consciously avoid on this podcast that we're talking about the business early lands, but I do have to say that you brought up to, in the book on a number of occasions, Desmond Morton. Earlylands, our firm, takes its name from Desmond Morton's home, which is very nearby Chartwell, Churchill's home. And I've always been captivated by Morton's story, sort of the behind the scenes role he played as a interlocutor with Churchill during his wilderness years. But I'm curious, just tell us a little bit about how you came to see Desmond Morton. Again, a figure who I think is so neglected, but someone who I think Churchill valued, at least for a fair portion of time, their friendship and relationship. Tell us how you see that.
Desmond Morton was a senior British civil servant who worked in industrial intelligence gathering, which was really critical in the 30s when the British were trying to assess
Right.
Germany's illegal rearmament program, and particularly important to Churchill, who is outside the government at this time, is not receiving the information that he would had he been a government minister, but through his friendship with Morton and others, is able to warn the British people about the build-up of German military might, despite the fact that the government does not want to advertise this. So I think that is Morton's major role in the Churchill story and his most important contribution to history. He then comes with Churchill into Downing Street and serves as an intelligence conduit between Churchill and various elements of the security services and Bletchley Park and other places, but also serves as an intermediary between Churchill and the Free French. For various reasons, some of which remain unclear, he does not enjoy continued
Right.
favor with Churchill throughout the Second World War, and his influence greatly wanes. It's not a hugely significant role he is given, as one might expect, and I'm not entirely certain why it was that he found himself slightly isolated and became increasingly bitter about this.
Yet another book to be written, right? But I've always been captivated by Morton's story in that he did not write the tell-all memoir. My time with Winston. I think he burned his personal papers before he died, wanting to sort of, I guess, placed utmost value on discretion, which is
Yeah,
certainly
well, that
something to be
which
admired.
is a capital offence if you are a historian. To burn your papers
Right.
is completely unforgivable.
Absolutely. Desmond Morton may be my object of real interest, but who for you, when you were researching this book, what other, I hate to say minor figures in history because they have an outsized impact, but who else came across your radar who you found particularly intriguing that we may not know about or enough about?
Just so many people. I think that these diplomats are real unsung heroes, many of them. And if they're not unsung heroes, they're certainly a joy to get to know because they were all well educated. And I don't mean that as a snobbish value. I mean it's purely from the value of the correspondence and the literature they've left behind. They wrote beautifully and often very humorously. And I find that being in their company is a source of fascination and great pleasure. You talked about Spain. There are very few politicians who have been as unpopular as Sir Samuel Hoare, the man responsible for the Hoare-Laval Pact, which tried to appease Mussolini after the Italian dictator had invaded the state of Abyssinia, or Empire of Abyssinia, I should say. And yet, he plays a really significant role in keeping the Franco government neutral because he's sent by Churchill as a form of exile, it should be
Right.
said, to the Madrid embassy. But there he plays a very important part, and he does it with an awful lot of style. He's constantly trying to suggest to the Spanish government that the Germans are about to invade at any stage. And he makes things up quite shamelessly. He sends off his commercial counselor to the Minister of Transportation and says that the British would like to compete for the competition that has clearly been started for re-tarmacking the roads near the French-Spanish frontier. And when the Minister of Transportation inevitably asks why the British are under the conviction that the roads are going to be retarmacked, he is to respond that he's seen some Germans measuring the roads and marking points on maps, and he assumes that the Spanish are engaged in some new road project. So all of these things constantly to keep the Spanish on their toes and to try and bring them to a state of vigilance regarding German infiltration and a possible German invasion. He's an incredible character. He's one that tries to undermine the German ambassador in Madrid by implying to the Spanish that actually he's a Nazi dissident, that he
Right.
is a man who is sharing Nazi and German secrets with him by suggesting that the fact that his embassy and residence is adjacent to the embassy and residence of the German ambassador allows them to have clandestine
Right.
meetings
All
during
right.
the night. I mean, this is, I think, the definition of sort of ingenuity.
He was sort of just making these ideas up himself, right? This was not a tactical plan orchestrated by London. This was more just his sort of good ideas club that some of them were quite brilliant, like he described.
Yeah, no, this was completely on its own. The ideas which came from London, but actually were more sanctioned by London, actually they originated with members of Hoare's staff, were one, to bribe
Right.
the members of the Franco regime. Huge sums of money were given to Franco's entourage and generals in the hope that if the Generalissimo ever did say, I have decided we are going to join the war on this date, these men would say, actually, we don't think
Right.
that this is a very good idea for these reasons. It probably wouldn't have worked. Mussolini spent a lot of money bribing Greek generals prior to his invasion of Greece, but that didn't stop the Greeks from fighting like tigers when the Italians did invade in the autumn of 1940. The other major idea was that Franco should be made dependent on
Right.
British largesse, that this country, which had been totally devastated by 3 years of civil war, had no fuel, had hardly any train tracks left, had very little cotton, very little food, should be given enough but no more to survive, that enough but no more should be let through the British blockade, and that Franco should be made to feel that if at any moment he stepped out of line, the British could impose a total blockade and his regime would be vulnerable. And that
Right.
is managed quite brilliantly by various British civil servants.
Well, we can't talk about a book about allies and rivalries without trying to draw some contemporary lessons, of course, from the current status of allies and rivalries. There's almost an eerie resonance between your book and the current moment that we're in. You, of course, are aware that Allies at War appears in a photograph released by Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, showing, I think, right around the time of the initial strikes on Iran. And the book was on
It,
Netanyahu's desk.
It was on the very day that the war began, and it was the only image of either President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu on the day this war began. And when it was originally sent to me, I thought that this was a friend
Sure.
playing a rather odd joke by having placed my book on the Prime Minister's desk. But no, it was the genuine Israeli government's news feed, which had
Right.
shown blank shelves and an empty desk, Prime Minister Netanyahu on the telephone to President Trump, and just my book on the desk, chosen because of the title and because of what he certainly thought it signified.
So much there to unpack. But what does, again, it's always dangerous, of course, to try to draw huge lessons from history for contemporary moments. What does your book, how should we think about your book and how should we think about the contemporary moment and some lessons to take from it?
I think that there are two major lessons that could be taken from the book. There are lots of minor lessons, but the headline lessons are these. Number one is do not neglect your allies.
Indeed.
Allies are infuriating. Allies will always act selfishly and stupidly at times. In fact, I have written an entire book about how difficult it can be to work with allies and about how allies are simultaneously friends and rivals. That is almost the definition of being an ally. And there are very many moments when each of the major protagonists of the Second World War finds their collaboration with their fellow allies beyond exasperating, almost to the point of rupture. And yet, as Winston Churchill continually said to his subordinates and colleagues during the Second World War, there is only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. Britain couldn't have won the Second World War without allies. America could not have won the Second World War without allies. America needed Britain if, and this is at its most basic, simply as a launch pad from which to reinvade the continent of Europe and liberate the old world from the Nazi spectre. And you never know when you're going to need your allies. I mean, if we look at this Iran conflict now, there has been a lot of criticism from the White House of the reluctance of European powers to get involved. Well, there has been a lot of criticism of the American president by European powers for the fact that they have been denigrated, they've had tariffs put on them, they have been humiliated. There has been a lot of friction and tension that has characterized this relationship beforehand. And I'm not saying that were that not to have happened, it would have automatically meant that the Royal Navy and the French Navy and other European powers would have been joining this conflict in Iran, but it would have been a lot harder to have said no had this been a more harmonious relationship up to this point. So allies are critical, and you never know when you're going to need allies. And actually, when one thinks about allies as they are today, or allies as they have been since the Second World War, genuine allies, yes, they are rivals, but what unites them tends to be greater than
Indeed.
what divides them. And one has to look to the wider picture, and the wider picture being, for much of the 20th century, the containment and defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War, in the 21st century, the defeat of Islamic terrorism, and most of the major problems that we wish to deal with in this world today, not necessarily military ones even, but everything from the appallingly terrifying rate of climate change to global tax evasion to the sustainability of our planet to the best way to harness AI that becomes a net benefit
Right.
to humanity rather
Right.
than a unimaginable source of unemployment. All of these can only be dealt with on an international basis. It doesn't make much difference one nation going it alone. So that's lesson one. Do not neglect your allies. Lesson two requires allies to have a clear strategic picture, not just about what it is they want to achieve, although that is absolutely critical, but also about who or what represents the primary strategic threat. 1939, Germany invaded Poland, 1st of September. On the 17th of September, the Soviet Union
Right.
invaded Poland. Britain and France did not declare war on the Soviet Union. They did not declare war on the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union invaded neutral Finland in November of 1939, despite the outrage that this caused. This is not because they sympathized with the Soviet Union. It's not because they condoned the actions of the Soviet Union. It is simply because they realized that not all enemies, not all threats, not all acts of international brigandage could be punished simultaneously,
Right.
and therefore the primary threat had to be dealt with, and it was widely recognized that the primary threat was Nazi Germany. And so if we look at the global chessboard as it is today, I think we in Europe would say that it is the Russian Federation, which is acting as a rogue player, has launched the most destructive and longest running war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And then there are very legitimate concerns, both in the United States and in Europe, about the role of China and its pretensions to great power status, which it undoubtedly has already achieved, but how it's going to wield that power. If you have these two vast challenges about which there is not yet a consensus on how to deal with them, certainly not a consensus between Europe and America, it doesn't necessarily do to use all of your international goodwill and a vast amount of your armaments and treasure on an adventure in the Middle East, however deeply sinister the regime is that you have sought to displace.
Speaking of strategic but also operational planning, much of your book focuses on, for example, the dynamics, of course, between Churchill and Roosevelt and de Gaulle and such. But then there was the second order, the sort of military to military ties. And I'm thinking now, of course, of the tensions in the NATO alliance that are at the head of state level. But I'm also quite confident, I think, that at an operational level, at a military to military level, that these U.S. continues to be a very active partner and contributor and such. Tell us, what are some of the lessons that you drew of how the Allied militaries engaged, for better or worse, in relations to the heads of state battles?
Well, very much like the heads of state battles, everything comes down to leadership. If you set a good example of leadership, then it filters down through the ranks. Equally, we all know the cliche about the fish rotting from the head and how bad leadership filters down through the ranks. And to give a specific example of this, nobody could have done a better job than leading a genuine Allied coalition than Dwight Eisenhower. Certainly no British general. The only potential person who could have equaled Eisenhower as a politician general was General George Marshall, head of the US Army
Of
and
course.
effectively chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was another great, great American hero. And Eisenhower was determined that nationalism and petty national rivalries and bickering should be left at the door. When he was planning Operation Torch in London, this was the first British-American joint enterprise, the invasion of French North Africa, which was going to take place in the autumn of 1942. He heard about an American officer who when he was drunk, liked to boast in the mess that now the Americans were in the war, they were going to teach these limeys how to fight. Eisenhower was furious. He sacked the man. He
Hmm.
even threatened to force him to swim back to America. And later, he heard tell of a row between a British and an American officer, and he investigated, decided that the American colonel had been at fault, and sent him back to America. The British officer was absolutely appalled at this seemingly draconian punishment and intervened and begged the Supreme Commander to reconsider his decision. His appeal went along the lines of, "If you please, sir, he only called me a son of a bitch, and we in this island have learnt of late that this is used in America as a colloquialism that can almost amount to a term of endearment." Eisenhower was unmoved. He replied, "I heard he called you a British son of a bitch. That is quite different. My ruling stands." So I think that sort of level of leadership had a profound effect on the collaboration between the British and the Americans and led to the most successful military alliance in history, an alliance that succeeded in ridding the Axis from the shores of North Africa, the waters of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and Western Europe, while simultaneously laying the foundations for the post-war peace.
Right, for the NATO that we're discussing right now, right? That has been, I think, the most successful post-war alliance, certainly.
Certainly,
And let's
without
hope
doubt.
that, that there are highly capable officers, men and women, various types of uniforms in NATO that I think are continuing on, no matter what comes out of the White House or various other prime ministers' offices. Richard Evans, wonderful historian, of course, called Allies at War, a major work of original history, which again, I think that's such high praise from Richard Evans, but also now in this world in which we have tens of thousands of books about World War II, you are still producing a major work of original history. What do you think is underexamined? Give us a sense of the historiography of the war now that you've written this book, and certainly you've read more than 99.9% of us. Is there areas that you still feel are truly understudied, that deserve more treatment from yourself or others in the field?
There are, but it would be quite hard to see how they would capture the public imagination in the same way. For instance, I think that there is not nearly enough understanding of the role that the neutral nations played. I've dealt with some of them, but not all of them. I didn't deal with Switzerland. I
Right.
didn't deal with South America. I didn't deal with many of the neutral nations in Asia and Africa. All of that should be part of the global war. Similarly, the financing of the war, both from the Axis perspective and the Allied perspective, is seriously understudied by comparison to everything else.
Right.
Scholars will and have looked at these things, but if you use the word neutral in a title, it's not going to send people rushing to the bookshops.
One last question about your research, and you alluded to this when we were talking about Russia earlier, and this moral compromises that had to be made in engaging with Stalin, and of course, Churchill had been an arch nemesis of communism since essentially the end of World War One. How did you approach writing about the moral compromises that Churchill and others had to make in dealing with a regime and an individual who I think they found quite loathsome?
Well, the most important thing is to put them in their historical context and to not make moral judgments yourself. People can make moral judgments on history, but they shouldn't really be historians. Nobody will find anything very interesting or very historically worthy in a book about the Nazis that just says on page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, etc.,
Right,
etc.,
right.
gosh, they were evil. They were really evil. What they were doing was appalling. This is the lowest form of it. That is not the job of the historian. The job of the historian is to explain what happened and why it happened and how it happened. And all of those are different and subtly different distinctions. A lot of people, many of them for understandable reasons from Eastern Europe and Central Europe, could not understand how the British and the Americans seemingly allowed Stalin to take over such a large swathe of territory in Europe at
Right.
the end of the Second World War and subject them to the misery of Soviet Bolshevism. And I'm sure we can all deeply, deeply sympathize with that, as well as recognizing the awful irony that this was a war, so the British and the Americans claimed, to make the world safe for democracy,
Sort of the
safe
Atlantic
for
Charter, right?
yes, they're based on the Atlantic Charter, based on self-determination, based on liberty, based on independence, where small nations would be allowed to thrive alongside large nations. And yet, there was precious little the British and the Americans could do to stop Stalin from taking over these countries, since the Red Army was in the business of expelling the Germans from these countries and was therefore in the business of occupying these countries. Similarly, when the mass graves at Katyn outside Smolensk were discovered by the Germans in 1943, the British had a fairly good idea that it had indeed been the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, that was responsible for the, as it turned out, 21,000 Polish deaths.
Right.
Poles who were taken prisoner in the war between the Soviet Union and Poland, taken to prisons inside the Soviet Union, had their hands tied behind their backs, and were shot in the back of the head. The Soviets claim that this is German propaganda and it's the Germans who have committed this atrocity. What do the British do? Do they accuse their allies who have just won the single greatest victory of the Second World War, the Battle of Stalingrad, of lying? Do they rupture the alliance and give Hitler his one chance, his only chance of staving off total destruction, which is the sundering of this alliance? Or do they go along with this appalling fiction? And they decide to go along with this appalling fiction. As Churchill himself says, no amount of remonstrance on our part will bring these men back to life. But a serious amount of evil could be done by the British and the Americans accusing Stalin of having murdered gallant Poles. It is a horrible, horrible choice. But I think even if one was to look at it from a strictly utilitarian point of view, one can nevertheless see that the westward march of the Red Army did at least stop the Holocaust. The Soviet Union under Stalin could be a deeply anti-Semitic place. Stalin himself was an anti-Semite. Jews in the Soviet Union, as very much Jews, and even more so in Tsarist Russia, were often subject to appalling discrimination and even death, but it was nothing on the scale of the Holocaust. And the wholesale murder of national peoples was on a relatively smaller scale than that perpetrated by the Nazis. Of course, that is not the slightest drop of comfort to a family that's had its professor father murdered by the Soviets simply because he's an intelligent Pole who believes in Polish independence. That's of no comfort to the millions of people who suffered and died under communism. But on a purely numbers basis, one could say that more people died in the German area of Central Eastern Europe than did under the Soviet regime during the war itself.
Right. Well, as Timothy Schneider labeled it, the bloodlands, and the very essence of moral compromise, as you just described. Well, let's take something far less emotionally charged. And I love here in my notes, I have classical music detour written down. And between appeasement and now the writing of Allies at War, you published a wonderful little book called Perfect Pitch, which is a guide to 100 classical masterpieces based on your lifelong passion for music. And I am a completely self-taught aficionado of classical music. I love it to death. Not raised as a musical child. I had to teach myself. And I found your book to be a wonderful way to dive into various pieces of music that I don't know about. What was behind that? What was behind that very distinct break between these large, magisterial, as they say, histories?
It was the pandemic. I never would have done it were it not for the COVID pandemic. I was locked down, as everyone else was in Britain, with notable exceptions for senior politicians. And I was unable to visit the archives, which I needed to visit to research Allies at War. And I thought, well, what can I do now? I thought I could write about a great passion that I had. And also, I had been sharing during the pandemic, when there wasn't very much else going on, links to some favorite pieces of music with friends, with just a couple of paragraphs I wrote about the composer or what this piece made me feel or what was happening in European history at that time. Because I think, actually, I'm going to undermine my book in one sense now. I don't believe you have to have any knowledge about classical music. I don't think you need to know how to spell Mozart to enjoy Mozart. If you listen to it and you like it, that's all it is. If you listen to something and it moves you, that's all it is. But so often people think that they need some element of knowledge to know what's going on. They need a tiny bit of
Sure.
guidance that this is what it would set out to be. These are very short essays. They're about 500 words each on a particular piece of music. And then there's a link to a Spotify playlist, which will allow you to listen to that piece of music. And if you don't like that piece, move on to the next. There's no
Right.
accounting for taste. So that was what lay behind it. The only other thing, though, is that perhaps what is helpful is the list itself, in that the other thing that people have asked me for many years, knowing that I'm a classical music obsessive, is what should I listen to? There's
Right.
so much. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of composers, and each of them wrote thousands and thousands of pieces. Well, what is worth listening to and what is not worth listening to? There are certain pieces of music which I would suggest could put you off classical music for life if you're coming to it. So having a list in chronological order where you can pick and choose, dip in and out, was in and of itself, I thought, a useful thing to put out there.
Like I was telling you beforehand, it's sort of my go-to as a gift or thank you gift. It's a small little book and it's easily transportable. So I would highly recommend Perfect Pitch. But as we close out the episode, we always ask this. We always ask our readers to suggest a handful of books that they would recommend, usually, of course, in their subject area. Again, this is about World War II, so I don't know where to start. But I would ask you at least give us the one single volume, or it could be multi-volume, but the one work of history related to the war that you would recommend someone read if they're interested, either a specialist or just someone who feels like they should know more about the Second World War. What's the best single volume history that you would recommend?
Gosh, it's very hard to name a single volume history that you could take as the single one. You need to take so many because it is so vast. What I can recommend is a primary source, which is just a joy to read. And if you want to have a better understanding of Churchill, it's Jock Colville's On the Fringes of Power, which are the diaries of Churchill's private secretary throughout the Second World War. And it is a wonderful over-the-shoulder
Sure.
account of Churchill during the war. Then also the brilliant diaries showing a very different side of Churchill, edited by Alex Danchev, of Field Marshal Alan Brooke, effectively the British chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, most senior military man in Britain from 1942 to 1945. And it deals with his very, very difficult relationship with Churchill and the volatility of Churchill as a military leader. It will, I think, show people a different side to Churchill to the one which we have all grown up with knowing as the Churchill myth, or the more
I couldn't agree
popular
with you
one.
more. I read the diaries about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's amazing to see a man who's this being Alan Brooks, just torn between such deep respect and also at times, I think, loathing for Churchill. What a wonderful book.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful book.
Well, I can certainly recommend Tim Bouverie's Allies of War. Tim, thank you for coming on, my friend. We have covered the gamut here from classical music to the war in Iran to Spain and the Second World War. That's a lot for 50 odd minutes. So my deep thanks to you for joining.
Todd, thank you very much for having me.